Sounds like a challenge. As you have been informed, I am Pershing. John Joseph, oh, well, thank you very much. John Joseph is the name that my parents gave me. The Iron General is the name that historians gave me. Black Jack Pershing is the name newspapermen gave me when they wished to write about my exploits, but could not use the name that the sensitive and offended cadets of the United States Military Academy, where I was a TAC officer in charge of discipline, they gave me a name there too. I'll tell you about that name. I had had a rare distinction prior to coming back to my alma mater in 1897. I had directed, I had led troops that many officers in the Army did not wish to be involved with, did not wish to be associated. What would be unique about those troops that would cause them to have that stigma? Do you know? It was the color of their skin. I had led on engagements in Montana the 10th Cavalry. They had a nickname also. Who knows it? Buffalo Soldiers. Yes, indeed. And do you know who gave them that name? Their adversary. Indeed. And it was not a racial slur as mine was. It was a testament to their accomplishments. It was flattery. It was a compliment. Yes, they had bushy black hair and a dark complexion, as did the American bison. But they were relentless in their duty. And they rode all night and all day to accomplish their mission, just like the buffalo. It was a testament to what they accomplished. Fine troops. And I would be reunited with them later on, but we'll talk about that later. So it was the Buffalo Soldiers who earned me that infamous nickname. It was not Blackjack. I'll let you to your imaginations as to what exactly they called me. This probably would be a very good opportunity for me to say that if you are equipped with a device in your pocket that you use as a telephone occasionally and a computer most of the time, would you please silence it now? I envy you for having that kind of technology. You see what I had to deal with. And there's a story around that as well. So now you know me. I won't ask the cadets to raise their hands and answer the question I typically ask, and that is, who does not know who John Joseph Pershing is? I won't let you embarrass yourself in front of the cadre, in case you didn't. Let me give you a little bit to go on about my background. I will tell you overall, I wore the uniform of the United States Army or West Point Military Academy for 40 years. And during that service, I always believed that I was destined to be something other than a soldier, until it was quite obvious to me that my time had run out and that was my lot in life. You see, I was born in 1860. And I was born in time to witness a conflict in Missouri, where I lived, with my family, that would change anyone's life. And even though I was only 3 and 4 years old, I took notice of how neighbor made war against neighbor. Sons and brothers and cousins fought each other during what we called the war between the states, and what you refer to now as the Civil War. What I saw, ladies and gentlemen, would encourage no one to become a soldier. My family's fortunes were lost in a Great Depression greater than what happened in 1929, 1873. My father's fortune was wiped out. And consequently, if I wanted an education and to pursue my destiny, I would have to achieve it myself. Tonight I will be speaking about destiny, mine, this nation's, and I would like you to be thinking about yours. Now, as you can see, there is a demographic divide in the room. Not entirely, but a little bit. And generally, the younger people in the room are seated on this side. You have your destiny before you. Some of the gentlemen and ladies on the other side may believe that most of their destiny has already been established. I believe that destiny is not your destination. It is what you accomplish, what you achieve, and what you experience in the journey to your destination. I believe that we can influence our destiny, but we certainly cannot control it. And one of the best ways to influence your destiny is to prepare for it, regardless of what the reality will be. One of the best ways to prepare for one's destiny is what you have all done in your life at one time or another, and what many in this room are doing right now. Hazard a guess what word I'm thinking of? Education, I believe, is the best preparation for destiny. If any of you have studied the career of John Joseph Pershing, you'll know that preparation was my highest priority. And after I accomplished everything I could as an active duty officer, I retired to prepare the most beautiful cemeteries in the world. They are located in France, and they honor in 8 different places the brave men from our nation and others that gave their lives in the final sacrifice during the Great War. So let's talk about preparation for destiny. I believed I needed that education, even if I had to achieve it myself. There were no scholarships, grant and aid, that sort of thing in my day. You either had the money and paid it, or you found another way, and I did. One of my early jobs was as a summer school teacher for students that no one else wanted to teach. I've given you a clue already as to why that would be. What distinguished those students from all others that made people unwilling or less likely to teach them? The color of their skin. I taught African American children in summer school to earn money for my own education. And while I was teaching them reading, writing, and arithmetic, they taught me something as well. They taught me that every culture, every person on this earth deserves the opportunity to achieve their destiny and not be held back by prejudice or governmental institutions. That was a losing battle back in my day, but I did what I could during the course of my career and my influence to improve the lot for African American troops. Although now, 100 years later, historians have rewritten my story, and you might find some things to the contrary. We can talk about that later. As I was attending college, not yet having achieved graduation, my sister showed me a clipping from the newspaper. There was a contest, and first prize was a free education. Well, that was much better than what I was achieving. I put my hat in the ring, I competed, and I won the contest. All expenses paid, trip, education. Isn't that a wonderful prize? And it was free. No, it wasn't. Nothing of value in this life, ladies and gentlemen, and the young people may not have learned that lesson as much as others have. Nothing is free that's valuable. There is always a cost to be paid. And the cost that I paid for my free education at West Point Military Academy was 6 years of service. Now, I always loved horses. I was a pretty fair horseman back in Missouri. I chose the cavalry. My first posting sent me to the deserts of the southwest part of our country. And it was there that it was my task to lead men in missions that either chased or fought the Apache and the Comanche. And because of some of the lessons I had learned already in my young life, I chose to engage my adversary on different terms. I learned their simple culture. I learned their sign language. And I demonstrated my empathy to my adversary every chance I had. And I got a different response than some of the other second lieutenants who were just there to do battle. I had some success with the Native American. And later on, the Army would make me Chief of Scouts in the Dakota Territory because of my rapport with the Native American. I have seen this Army, this nation's military, at its greatest moment and at its worst. Later on in my career, I would be in the Dakota Territories in South Dakota when an infamous event occurred. We called it the Battle of, what we know it today as the Massacre of Wounded Knee. My troops and I did not participate in the battle, as it was known then. But one of our tasks, me and my Indian scouts, was to remove the frozen bodies from the plain days after. And we wrestled with those frozen bodies from the frozen ground, men, women, and children of the Lakota tribes. That, I believe, was our worst, our lowest moment in the military. And I saw it firsthand. And our greatest moment may have been my perhaps best known achievement. And that was leading an army to liberate the empires and our allies from the tyranny caused by Austria, Hungary, and Germany in the early part of the 20th century. We called it the Great War. There was nothing great about it except its size and scope. We called it the war to end all wars. Wasn't that optimistic? You call it World War I. We would have never numbered it that way. We believed there was only ever going to be one. When it was all said and done, over 8 million men who wore a uniform on both sides had been buried. That's if they could have been recovered. A total of approximately 25 million had died as a result of the war or the Spanish influenza that accompanied it. Now, I think it's interesting that the Spanish are blamed for the flu. Do you know why that is? Because more Spaniards died in the flu than anywhere else. Do you know where it came from? Kansas. It started on a farm. That farm boy was drafted into the army. He took it to the training camp, Fort Riley and others, Camp Funston. He mixed in with another group of soldiers, and they spread it around the world. Millions and millions of people died before it was all done. As I mentioned, I had the distinction of serving with the Buffalo Soldiers on 2 occasions. When I was at the West Point Military Academy, I was attempting to teach discipline to the cadets there. They thought I was too strict, too stern. One day in the dining hall, I walked in and saw that there were a few cadets who were supposed to be working in the kitchen, just talking. I was a stickler about cleanliness. I found a pot that was dirty, and I threw it at the cadets standing in the corner. They sneered at me. I found a pan that hadn't been cleaned properly. Again, I pitched it in their direction. They laughed at me until I walked over and found a dirty meat cleaver. Looks like a hatchet if you've never seen that. When I went like this, I was amazed at how quickly the kitchen cleared. I will admit that I probably was a bit too strict, but I had already served with other officers who were unprepared for leadership. And when they did so, their enlisted personnel were poorly served. Men died, missions failed because of poor officer preparation. And I believe that if I had to do it myself, I would change that parameter. Well, I was rescued from the academy. Who knows what might have happened to me at the hands of the cadets or perhaps the other officers who didn't agree with me being so stern. An event occurred in 1898, you history buffs would remember. We decided to liberate the holdings of Spain from the tyranny of that government. I was sent with my Buffalo Soldiers to Cuba. And I was not the only one there who was there to liberate them from the tyranny of Spain. A friend that I had met in New York, former police commissioner, had put together his own unit and made himself a colonel. Some of you are nodding. You know who I'm talking about. I, being a personal friend, would call him by his first name, Ted. You know him as Teddy Roosevelt. And on one particular steamy afternoon near Santiago, Cuba, on the heights, Teddy Roosevelt led his Rough Riders up Kettle Hill on the right flank. And I and other officers took the Buffalo Soldiers up the left flank. I looked across the battlefield and I could only see one man. He was easy to spot. My friend Ted, on a horse. The only one on a horse. If you want to make yourself a conspicuous target, be the only one on the battlefield on a horse. How he survived that day, I don't know. He took Kettle Hill, we took San Juan Hill. When it was all said and done, Ted wrote a book about it. He wrote a lot of books back then. If you've ever read the book, you'd be surprised to know that anyone else was in Cuba besides Ted. He was not shy about taking credit for what we achieved there. And because I decided to remain quiet about the facts of the case, a few years later I was rewarded for my discretion. When Teddy Roosevelt, the President of the United States, raised my rank from captain to brigadier general. He wanted to give me a rise in rank, maybe major, colonel, and found out he could only promote generals. So I became a general. Over 835 other Army officers. All of a sudden, I lost quite a few friends in the Army. I was made a brigadier after I had already served in the jungles of Mindanao as a captain. I had come back to Washington, spent some time as an attaché, and had the good fortune of changing my destiny. I hadn't given up on the idea of being a lawyer. In fact, I had even attended law school at Nebraska University, where the Pershing rifles emanated from, which gave the ROTC programs nationally a real head start, what we accomplished there. So now I'm in Washington and I am dancing across a ballroom floor with a daughter whose father happened to be the richest man in Wyoming and a senator in charge of the Military Appropriations Committee. I married that girl. Wouldn't you? Because I loved her. And I was very fortunate that she had the poor judge of character to have fallen in love with me as well. We honeymooned in Tokyo on the government. I was sent there as an observer of the Russo-Japanese War. I saw a lot of killing and dying out there. Let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, I hope this nation never has to face the Japanese Empire anymore. They are formidable, and we will pay a heavy price if we are victorious. I began to prepare for a different destiny. Not so much as a lawyer. Perhaps I would remain a soldier a little while longer, but I was now a family man. And I believed that my greatest achievement would be in the raising of my children. My destiny was to be the best father I could be. They joined me on my second tour of duty in Manila, where I was in charge of the entire military. And it was there that I re-engaged with an old enemy, the Moros. That's a Spanish derivation of the word Moor, which refers to Muslims from the part of the northern African continent. The Moros were fanatical, and they believed that they had the right and the province to kill anyone who wasn't also a Muslim. This was not the first time America engaged Muslims, but it was the first time we did so in an insurrection. They did not want to live peacefully. I fell back on my training and my experience with a Native American. I would walk into the Moro village unarmed, as I am tonight. I would engage the datas, the chieftains. I would sit down with them, show them my empathy, show them my goodwill, and ask for theirs in return. Those who made peace and made friends with the American military would prosper. And those who did not, well, let's just say I would find graves for them. Now, I want to dispel a rumor right now that anyone that was buried under a detail commanded by Pershing, never, ever were they buried with the carcasses of pigs. But it did happen. It was used to intimidate them. I did not do it, although I have been given credit for that. I don't consider credit the proper word. I was attempting to engage my enemy on different terms. And I believed, from the reading of a book that you may have read, and if you haven't yet, I suggest you do, Sun Tzu, The Art of War. It was first translated into English in 1910. I was quick to read it. One of the many precepts, one of the many lessons in that book, I had already put into practice. And I practiced again with the Moros. You cannot defeat your enemy simply by killing all of his warriors. You must defeat his strategy. The Moros wanted one great battle on their religious mountain, their sacred spot, and they were trying to draw my army to that place. I put my army on a ship, and we sailed out of Manila Harbor in the opposite direction. And I did so with publicity. It convinced the Moros that they had time to go to the mountain and allow their women and children to catch up later. It was their tactic then, and it is the tactic of some who fight under a Muslim flag now, to amalgamate themselves with women and children, with innocent non-combatants, and thus play upon our good nature to not shoot back because of who was among them. Our ship turned south when it was out of sight. We came around the back of the island. We disembarked, and my troops got to the top of the mountain before they did. And when they arrived, it was just the warriors. The women and children were at the bottom of the mountain. I made sure that my cavalry troops cut them off and prevented them from rising up to the heights. And now it was just warrior against warrior. And if they wanted to fight to the last man, I would give them their wish. They did. Yes, it's true that I was suggested, recommended for the Medal of Honor in that engagement. I squelched it. We had achieved peace finally. That was my reward, because I had defeated their strategy. And that would not be the last time I employed that tactic. One of my next assignments was in Mexico and Texas. Stationed at Fort Bliss, I was guarding the porous Mexican border. Banditos were coming across the border to attack Americans, trying to prompt a war between our two countries. Please tell me, ladies and gentlemen, after 110 years, that you've solved the problem on the Mexican border. What?
No.
Well, keep working on it. While I was there, I had the pleasure of serving with some very good troops. One of them was a fresh graduate of the U.S. Military Academy, although it did take him 5 years to get through his studies. Yes, he was from California, and his heritage, his ancestors, well, they were Confederate commanders from the war between the states, but that didn't hold him back. And he believed his destiny was to be a soldier. He even believed that he would die on the field of battle. He was brash and cocky, braggadocious, but I liked him. And he was a heck of a rider. Boy, oh boy, could that man ride a horse. And his sister was kind of cute too. Nita, I took a liking to both of them. And Nita began to visit Fort Bliss much more often after that occurred. What I've skipped over is a very sad episode, but I think I should share it with you. I met Nita in 1916. In 1915, my family was living at the Presidio in San Francisco in a house temporarily, while I was preparing their home with me at Fort Bliss. I was about 2 weeks away from inviting them down. It was a steamy morning in August 1915, and I happened to be in my office all alone when the phone rang. Normally I would have allowed the orderly to answer it, but instead this day I picked it up and answered it myself. The newspaper man on the other end of the line did not expect to speak to the commanding officer, but he called with a question. He wanted to know what General Pershing thought of the news of the fire. And the man who answered the phone to his call said, "What fire?" "Yes, this is Pershing." "Are you quite sure?" "Say that again." "I thank you for calling." A fire had occurred in a residence at the Presidio. The highly polished floors were also highly flammable. My lovely wife, my 3 daughters, who looked just like her, smart, beautiful, with such potential, had all been killed. My son had been spirited out the back windows by our servant downstairs. I visited the site myself, and then I took their bodies to Wyoming, buried them there, and put my son under my sister's care for the rest of his education. He was but 4 years old when it happened. And my destiny changed. My whole life changed. In a way that no one would ever wish for. Now all I had left was the Army. My assignment was to chase down the bandit Pancho Villa. He wanted to take over the Mexican government. He wanted to do so by starting a war that eventually would bring the two nations against each other, and then he would take the helm of the Mexican government in the chaos that ensued. I took 8,000 troops on an expedition called the Mexican Punitive Expedition into Mexico and into the deserts by about 100 miles. On one particular day, that impressive second lieutenant was sent out to buy supplies on our expedition. Well, he had other ideas. You see, he had been telling me on our horse rides together that he believed the future of cavalry was not with the horse. It was with the machine. He had a vision that eventually the cavalry would be mechanized. I thought it was pish-posh. And I thought cavalry would always be on horseback. Well, he took a Dodge touring car that had been sent down there. They sent us a fleet of them. He strapped a Maxim machine gun to the back seat, took 2 of my sergeants, and they went out of camp in a flourish. And I remember hearing him yell over his shoulder, "I'll be back with Pancho Villa." About 2 days later, he returned, not with Pancho, but he had 2 of his lieutenants flown over the front fenders like dead deer on a hunting expedition. Do you know who that second lieutenant was? I bet you more people on this side of the room do. Yes, sir. Tell me the name.
George Patton.
Indeed. I called him Georgie. He was as tall as me, but a little broader. While we were chasing Pancho, a horrible war broke out in Europe. And for 3 years, the obsolete empires of that continent figured out some ingenious ways to kill off their working class, the ones who wore their uniforms. Their best and brightest were dying in large numbers every day, while we were baking in the Texas sun and chasing what appeared to be an imaginary ghost. I never caught up with Pancho, but somebody did eventually. The president had been re-elected on the premise that he would keep us out of Europe's war. And 3 months after, he found out about a telegram that had been sent by Germany to Mexico, promising that if they got into the war effort against us, when Germany prevailed and beat everyone, all of its adversaries, and beat the United States as well, Germany would then give Mexico a prize. Anyone know what the prize would have been? Arizona, New Mexico, and they promised California to the Japanese. The Japanese turned them down, and so did the Mexicans. That enraged our president. Not so much what they offered, but the fact that they had used our telegraph lines that was buried under the sea in the Atlantic Ocean. They had used our line to communicate the telegram. Well, for whatever reason, our president, my commander-in-chief, was offended. It didn't matter. We declared war in April of 1917, 101 years ago, and I was called to Washington for a new assignment. I believed I would become a division commander. That's the next likely step. Nita Patton, she wanted to join me in the trip, so I allowed her to travel on the train with me. Nita Patton, I found out during that trip, she thought her destiny was to become the very next Mrs. Pershing. That didn't happen, ladies and gentlemen, but we did have a lovely train ride. When I arrived, I met with the Secretary of War, Baker. He went back to the President after our meeting and came back to me with the news that I would not command a division. I would command them all. I would take the Army to Europe and I would help end the war. I said, okay, and which Army, where are they located? And Baker said to me, it's your job to make one. At that point in time, ladies and gentlemen, we had but 200,000 men in uniform. At that point in time, the British had buried 500,000 men, and the French twice that. Eventually, our army, what would become known as the American Expeditionary Force, would grow to a size 20 times the original. 4 million men would be in uniform, and ladies, although there was a very small role for ladies in the Army back then. I'm glad to see that that has changed. My wife was a suffragette. You know what that is, right? So that meant I was a suffragette as well. I was very sympathetic to women's rights and women's causes. I didn't think they should have to ride side saddle. No, not at all. Very uncomfortable. I tried it once. And I fell off. Yes, I did. And so, with Georgie Patton on my staff and some other talented individuals, we wore civilian clothes when we left Governor's Island in May of 1917. When we arrived in England, I was met by potentates and politicians and top brass. And they had parades and they had dinners to celebrate that America had come into the war. At dinner that night, the King of England was practically dancing around the room, giddy about the promise he had just gotten from my president. My president had promised him 5,000 aeroplanes. Wonderful! I knew he had 8. And I left 5 of them in Texas when I got on the trip. Not only was I going to have to win a war that hadn't been won by either side in 3 years, but I was going to have to make good on every promise that every politician from the United States had dreamed up just to win favor with our allies in Europe. My first challenge was to overcome what Major Doolin referred to early on this evening, the fact that the French and the British pointed out that my army was too inexperienced to fight on its own. Just come over, we'll train you. Just bring the infantry and the machine guns. Don't worry about artillery, service of supply. We'll take care of everything. Oh, and while you're over here, why don't we amalgamate your troops into our ranks? Well, ladies and gentlemen, I never told this to their face. You can't speak that way to the French. They get offended so easily. I said to them, no, we will fight as an autonomous army. Because I was not willing to allow civilian men dragged out of their communities, drafted sometimes against their will, in an unpopular war, to come across the ocean just to be replacement corpses for the French and British, who were dying in greater numbers every day. I would not allow my virile, robust doughboys to be wasted in mud-filled, rat-infested trenches, stretching from the North Sea in the north, 450 miles to the Swiss Alps. They had been locked in a war of attrition and stalemate for 3 years, fighting the same worn-out strategy that hadn't worked in the last war. When I arrived with my wonderful doughboys, I wanted to change the game. What did Sun Tzu tell us? Defeat their strategy. I was roundly criticized for my tactics, but eventually open warfare would replace trench warfare. And consequently, after battles in Cantigny, Château-Thierry, Montfaucon, and Belleau Wood to the Marines in the group, we finally had our own sector and our own battle. And we squashed the salient at Saint-Mihiel in record time, in half the time we had planned. This was in September of 1918. We captured 12,000 troops, 1,000 cannon, 500 machine guns. None of them would ever spill another drop of American, French, or British blood. And then a genius on my staff named George Catlett Marshall, you might have heard of him, designed a plan to move 600,000 men 40 miles without the enemy knowing anything happened. And we went from the Saint-Mihiel salient, the greatest success we've had so far, into one of the most challenging battle scenarios this country has ever faced, including today. We fought between the Meuse River on the right and the Argonne Forest on the left. And the no man's ground in between had been entrenched and fortified by the Germans for 3 years. I had a chance to walk into a former command post for the Germans, and I was looking at furniture in their forts better than I'd ever had in my house. They'd been there that long. They owned that part of France by then. Now, in the meantime, that second lieutenant was now a major, George Patton, and he would relentlessly beg me to put him in a tank battalion. I said, Georgie, your destiny is to be the greatest infantry commander under my command. Well, Fox Connor convinced me that if I didn't give him tanks, he would never stop whining about it. He was right. So Patton trained his own tank battalion and they went into battle in a little town named Cheppy, very early on in the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Well, Patton was so excited because he saw that his battalion was about to overtake the German stronghold. He rushed forward with nothing but a pistol in his hand because he wanted to be the first one in the village. They nearly shot his leg off. I visited him in the hospital. I said, George, you begged me to put you in tanks. Now stay in the darn tank! Most of our casualties were suffering in the Meuse-Argonne offensive. The last 47 days of the war, the fighting was relentless. Heroes emerged from that struggle, many of them too many to mention tonight. Sergeant York from Tennessee. I've told his story many times. There's another sad story we may not have time for tonight, and that is the story of Colonel Charles Whittlesey's group, the 308th Battalion. And the newspapers told their story in serialized version every day as it unwound over a period of 7 days. They were known as the Lost Battalion. He was without water and food for 5 of those 7 days. His last of 12 messenger pigeons. We used birds to deliver our message back then. You don't know how spoiled you are to have the technology in your back pocket that you have today. On his last bird, he attached a message. And that message was received and eventually responded to. He gave his location on that little slip of paper. And he said, and I quote, "We are being barraged by our own artillery. For heaven's sake, stop it." Eventually, we were able to relieve Whittlesey. He was the first man that we awarded the Medal of Honor to at the war's conclusion. 3 years later, he took a cruise by himself to Cuba. He told his wife he just needed to get away. And one evening on that cruise, Colonel Charles Whittlesey, after he could not deal with the memory of what had happened and the fact that he had been blamed for getting his battalion lost, and they were never lost. We knew where they were, we just could not get to them. Whittlesey wrote a note to his best friend, walked out to the rear of the ship, and jumped over the fantail into the dark Atlantic Ocean. Whittlesey destroyed himself because he could not live with the claim that he had lost his battalion. Today, ladies and gentlemen, 21, on average, American veterans do the same thing. They take their own lives. I can talk about numbers all night. We lost 116,516 in that war, and many more, over 200,000, were wounded, some of them maimed for life. Every day, on average, 21 of our great veterans take their own lives. It used to be 22. We are making incremental success. But any commander will tell you, incremental success does not win the battle. That is a reminder. That display that we see at every American Legion is a reminder that we still have work to do. We still have wounded soldiers. They are not disabled. They are wounded. And we need to help them heal. Back in my day, it was called shell shock. In World War II, battle fatigue. Now you call it something fancy with the acronym PTSD. What I pledge, and what you may pledge, is that we will change those terrible statistics. Now, I've talked about my destiny. Perhaps you've been thinking about yours. Remember, if nothing else from tonight's encounter, you must prepare for it. Fate will fool you. Hopes and dreams will fail you. But if you stay true to your preparation and your goal, and if your goal is good, in other words, your goal may be to be in service to those who matter most to you, or as many of the gentlemen on this side of the room and others who have worn the uniform of the United States military proudly and served proudly, you may choose to serve a cause greater than yourself. If that is your destiny, prepare for it with education and everything else that is available to you. Because heaven knows this nation needs many more from this side of the room to follow the great example we have on the other side of the room, with your exception, sir. There are many people that you could emulate as you achieve your destiny or as you pursue it. There's a young man in Florida. His name was Peter Wang. Does anyone know who I'm talking about? Peter Wang? Yeah. It's kind of an obscure reference, I know. Peter Wang was in the junior ROTC in Parkland, Florida, at the high school that was shot up by a crazed man about 2 weeks ago. Two other students that lost their lives that day, whose names I'm afraid I cannot recite for you, were also JROTC cadets. But Peter Wang was wearing his uniform that day. And he held doors and assisted in the exit of students who survived because of his help. And he was shot down and killed in the process of doing so. If ever your pursuit of your destiny seems to be too great, beyond your capabilities, look around the room. There are many examples you can follow. Think of Peter Wang. Though he was younger than you, he is a terrific example to follow. Eventually, you may be called upon to serve, as these gentlemen and ladies have been called upon to serve. Will you answer that call when you hear it? That's a question that only you can answer. And if I may quote a passage from a book that many of you are probably familiar with, Isaiah chapter 6, verse 8. And I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall go for us? Who shall we send? And I said, send me. Ladies and gentlemen, they sent John Joseph Pershing, and he performed very well. Speaking of performances, today I am dressed like a soldier, but I am not. There are people in this room who are real soldiers, and they are the true heroes. And it is to them that I take my hat off, and my heart goes out to them. Gentlemen, for the last hour or so, you've allowed me to pretend to be just like you. Thank you for that honor. I'm sorry, did I steal your line?
You have all the time you want.
All right, very good. Please make yourself comfortable. Thank you. That's the last honor you gave me. I'm not sure that I deserve it. I'm very appreciative of it. Thank you. Does anyone have a question for Pershing? Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. In some of the reading that I've done on
Uh-oh, I'm in trouble now.
Pennsylvania, the word gringo was assigned to U.S. troops that fought alongside you in against Pancho Villa. I've heard that the song "Green Grow the Lilacs" was sung by American troops while they were in that part of the country, and that is where the term gringo came from. Is that true?
That may be the most obscure explanation for that term. And I agree with you, sir, that may be the most accurate, if that's your assertion. Yes, indeed, there was a language barrier. So because they heard that refrain over and over again, it became identified with the troops. Where did Doughboy come from? Way off of your question. Anyone know that? They think it came from our troops arriving in France and eating so many donuts because that's what the Red Cross and the Salvation Army would offer, coffee and donuts. No, it was our troops marching through the dusty deserts of Mexico a few years earlier, being covered by the dust, and coming out of it covered as if they would have been powdered sugar over top of them. So that's where doughboy actually comes from. That is a wonderful question. I've never been asked that before. Thank you, sir. Any others? Yes, sir.
Can you speak a little bit about the conflict that you had with the Chief of Staff during World War I?
Oh, thank you. I thought you were going to ask me to speak French. I think it's very ironic that Pershing nearly flunked out of West Point because of French. And he was disgusted with it, having to work so hard on it to achieve that grade, because he knew he'd never use it again. He never did master the language. Chief of Staff. Now, which one are we talking about? Because I had several during the course. Or what particular disagreement are you referring to?
About how the seniority of the commanding general versus the seniority of the Chief of Staff compared to the leading general.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. Pershing was not shy about taking command and authority or usurping it. And many people believe that the Chief of Staff probably did outrank Pershing at that point, but really it came down to Pershing recognizing that the power was with the man who was on the scene, not the Chief of Staff back in Washington. And also, something that I didn't really stress is that unlike in recent campaigns with recent presidents, Pershing had total authority to do what he did over there. Wilson did not meddle, he did not direct Pershing's efforts, and he and Baker completely backed up Pershing when the British and the French went around Pershing to complain about him not cooperating with them. So yes, Pershing basically identified that I'm here, my 2 million man army is here, this is where the action is, this is where the decisions will be made. And he basically overcame the Chief of Staff. That's very good. But when he became Chief of Staff, that all changed. And perhaps the best Chief of Staff we've ever had, and Pershing would say this if he were here, is one of his best friends. He was even the best man at George's second wedding. His first wife died. George C. Marshall was an absolute brilliant tactician and administrator and diplomat. He was involved in the Treaty of Versailles negotiations, thank goodness, because they wouldn't let Pershing go. Pershing told Washington, London, and Paris, you should not end this war this way. If you don't end it as an unconditional surrender by the Germans on the other side of the Rhine River, when they know they've been beaten, we will repeat this in 20 years. He was wrong. It was 23, sadly. And they had to start counting the wars, World War I, World War II. Excellent question, Henry. Anything else? Yes, sir.
How did you get along with Douglas MacArthur?
That proud peacock. He was a fine soldier. I admired his abilities. He was one of the commanders in the Rainbow Division, the 42nd, who fought admirably, distinguished himself, and he was very brave to put himself out in front of his troops when that trend had already changed in World War I. Generally, commanders were back at a command post at the other end of a telephone line, or next to the bird coop, waiting for a message to come back. MacArthur was not shy about taking on deadly responsibility, and he handled it well. However, he had quite an ego, even greater than Pershing's perhaps, and he is known for it. Pershing is not. I will share this with you, that after the Great War, and both soldiers were stateside, they, for some reason or another, took an interest in the same woman. And she was a rather wealthy heiress, and very attractive and popular. She had been married before, had children. And both of them apparently were rivals for her hand in marriage. And MacArthur won. Now, when asked about it, I said, oh, that's poppycock. I was never interested in a woman to that degree. But I was also quoted after I transferred Douglas MacArthur to the Philippines. Let's see how the new bride enjoys the jungles of Mindanao. There's also a rumor that Pershing remarried. He met a young lady in France. Now, this is a story I don't generally offer to students, but since I feel like I'm on a roll, I'm going to go with it because it tells you a little bit more about the real man, Pershing. Soon after arriving in France, French wanted to demonstrate their gratitude, so they offered Pershing a gift, a painted portrait. Back then, they didn't work from selfies and photographs. You had to sit for the portrait. So you got to know the artist. And Pershing's artist was a 20-year-old, 19-year-old, gorgeous Romanian-born, dark-haired beauty named Micheline Resco. How she got the job, I don't know. But he was delighted that she did, and the two of them became friends, and then they became even more fond of each other. It is said that Pershing, when he would come back from the front and visit her in Paris, he would have the limousine driver stop and remove the 4-star license plates from the front of the car, and Pershing would sit in the front seat beside him until they got to her apartment. I don't know if that's true. I don't recall that. But I love to tell the story that their age was very different, and people would not have approved. So she believed that their relationship had no destiny. But Pershing tried to persuade her otherwise. So in one evening, we were sitting in her parlor, and I said, "My dear, you should not be so concerned about what other people say or think. Oh, no, it would not be right. It would be scandalous," she would say. And I said, "No, my dear, here, you're not thinking about this practically. You see, you are 19 years old, I am 57. I know that's a great difference, and some of you are saying, oh, no, that's inappropriate. But what I said to Micheline was this: at this point in our lives, I am 3 times as old as you are. But, my dear, in 19 short years, I will only be twice as old as you." Micheline was a wonderful artist. She was not a very good mathematician. And many people believe that they got married in 1946 while Pershing was a permanent resident at Walter Reed Army Hospital in a specially prepared penthouse suite above the hospital. He was dealing with dementia, although some biographers dispute that. I believe it was true. And some people believe that she was married to him in a very quiet, private ceremony. I don't know if it's true. But the debate is almost equal. I do know that after the war, she came to America and lived in the same town as Pershing, brought her mother with her, was a frequent visitor. Their relationship remained private. She was not seen in public with him. But toward the end of his life, she was a regular visitor at Walter Reed. And she was probably his most loyal friend and biggest fan.